Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to sessions on territory, ecology. This is our fifth and final session in this semester of the lecture series organized jointly by Professorship Marc Angélil and myself. And I would like to thank Sascha Delz, Hans Hortig, and Jörg Stovins for bringing these lectures together. This semester, together with our guests, we have been exploring the ways in which Anthropocene, this very contested category, both scientific and political, shapes the fields of architecture and urbanism. We have debated and tried to understand how the various complex social and ecological priorities implicated under the notion of Anthropocene will shape architecture and urbanism and design agency in a more general sense. And those priorities, as you can imagine, span between reduction of carbon emissions to the resource consumptions, to ecological footprint, to many other values and goals that we are debating across the globe. In discussing these questions, I also would like to highlight the notion of the urban and urbanism. We understand the urban as the site of our investigations. This is urban in an extended sense. It involves broadening of the perspective from cities to urbanizing territories, and even to the planet as a whole, of course. And therefore, the questions we put under spotlight are: how is the design agency to be understood within such changing environments or the transforming Earth systems? And in the past 2 semesters, over the past year, we had, I believe, 11 sessions. We have invited 11 speakers in groups that showed or examined how the agency of design, and especially urban and territorial design, will change. How will architects and urbanists' education and practice change? How should they respond? And it is therefore a great pleasure and not entirely coincidental that Eliza Scott will be our last speaker in the series of ecology, because she was very much the pioneer of such questions at the Department of Architecture since a number of years. Eliza Scott is an interdisciplinary scholar, artist, and a former park ranger, focused on contemporary art and design practices that engage pressing political, ecological issues, often with the intent to actively transform real-world conditions. Currently, she is joint professor in the history of art and architecture and environmental studies at the University of Oregon. She was formerly a postdoc at the History and Theory of Architecture here at the ETH Zürich. So we lost her, sadly, but she is doing amazing work. And Emily holds, let me say, a PhD in contemporary post-1945 art history from UCLA. Presently, she is working on many exciting projects, writing a book, and I would mention that in her current teaching, she focuses on land art, Anthropocene, and unnatural disasters. In the debate afterwards, we will have a pleasure to welcome also Dr. Christoph Kueffer. I will introduce him later. He is with us in the audience. So Emily's talk is titled To Unbreak by Breaking, Design Against Enclosure. And Emily sent us, or at least the student sent an essay a couple of days ago that highlights some of the issues that will come up in the talk. And I found a brief quote by Toyo Ito that Emily put forward in this essay. I thought it was really amazing. So he said the following: "Our way of life is still based in 20th century ideas, specifically a modernist philosophy that assures we can use science and technology to conquer nature. So we try to isolate ourselves from nature. Our cities are completely segregated from the environment. This kind of modernist thinking has reached its limit." So a pretty foundational issue, and Emily will help us unpack it. Thank you so much, and please welcome Emily Scott.
Well, first off, I just want to say, is the volume okay? Yes. Okay. I first want to just start off by thanking Milica and Marc for inviting me, and also Sasha Deltz and others for organizing the trip for me to be here. In my 5 or 6 years working at the chair of Philipp Ursprung at ETH, the ONA lecture series was always the lecture series that was the most consistently relevant to my own research and teaching, and I have come to so many ONA talks over the years. So it's just a tremendous pleasure and honor to be here on the other side of the podium today, and particularly just to see so many familiar people in the audience. So I couldn't be more thrilled to be here. I also want to thank Christoph Kueffer in advance for agreeing to be the respondent. It wasn't my idea, but it was the perfect person to choose. Some of you may or may not know, there are a couple of our former students in the room here, actually. The last class that I taught at ETH, which was spring of last year, was a class that Christoph and I co-taught together called Concrete Jungles, Urban Ecology and Its Design. And I couldn't think of a more fitting conversation partner, so I'm looking forward to his response in our conversation afterwards. Before starting, I also want to just take a moment to acknowledge the tireless and visionary work of the Parity Group here at the DARC. And to state my solidarity with a group of students who have come forward in the past months to report sexual harassment in the department. I applaud your collective efforts to make this institution and the field of architecture by extension more inclusive, equitable, and transparent. Yay. So my talk today, I actually have been thinking quite a lot about the Anthropocene. I'm teaching a graduate seminar right now in environmental studies at the University of Oregon called Sizing Up the Anthropocene, but I won't talk at all about the Anthropocene, really, at least by name in this talk. I'll talk a bit more about urbanism. And the talk itself is actually a version or an expanded version of an essay that I recently published in the catalog for this exhibition that's right now on view in Milan, the 22nd Milan Triennial, called Broken Nature, Design Takes on Human Survival. So this idea of broken nature is sort of an idea that I begin with and end with, as you'll see. And I also, before we get started, have another quote or epigraph. The Toyo Ito, actually, I hadn't thought of, but that was a perfect quote to set the tone for my talk tonight, or this afternoon. But I know that in the class earlier this semester, you also read a text by Raj Patel and Jason Moore, and I thought this was also a fitting kind of precursor before I launch into the talk. So every civilization has had some rendering of the difference between us and them, but only under capitalism is there a boundary between society and nature, a violent and tightly policed border with deep roots in colonialism. The cultural studies scholar Eva Horn begins her essay on air conditioning in the 2016 anthology Climates, Architecture and the Planetary Imaginary with a vivid description of stepping outside the temperate spaces of Singapore's lavish airport into the stifling tropical air beyond its shell. And some of you may know that just opened last month, as I understand it, this airport has been recently expanded by Softy Architects, and it now boasts the largest indoor waterfall in the world, so this very lavish interior. So she starts her text by describing this kind of disjunction between the inside and the outside. She goes on to discuss the standardization of interior climates worldwide, embodied in the endless repetition of sometimes heated, but more often cooled, pods of identical air all over the planet, between which certain classes at least spend more and more of their time. On some level, climate control represents the crystallization of architecture's most basic role, to provide protection from the elements or to offer a seal of comfort that, quote, liberates human society from the contingencies of nature, unquote. And those are Eva Horn's words again. By now, however, owing to the intensive energy consumption entailed, it is also transforming the elements themselves by contributing significantly to global warming and thereby rendering the outside world more potentially threatening. The barrier between the human and the environment that climate control poses is doubly insidious, not only destabilizing the planet's climate, but also limiting our perception of such an alarming change, not to mention of anything external to its narrow and thoroughly anthropocentric vision. Horn speaks about this in terms of a loss of climate intelligence, which I think we might extend to a much broader loss of environmental intelligence that is hampering our ability to comprehend the complexity of human nature entanglements, including, for example, the ways that something like air conditioning is embedded within technological, economic, environmental, social, and political systems alike. Taken further, the present moment is increasingly characterized by the dynamics of inside versus outside, one expression of which is people's uneven exposure to nature itself, including the ever more volatile and inhospitable environmental conditions produced by anthropogenic climate change. One need not look further than to the migrant worker deaths, which have been associated with the construction of Zaha Hadid's gleaming Qatar soccer stadium, many of which are thought to have resulted from extreme heat stress. The dream of unbroken enclosure to which only some have access, breaks relations, throwing things wildly out of whack. The growing attention to sustainability within architecture and design would seem to redress some of this, or at minimum, to reflect rising concern about the environment within these fields. This is just a Google search of sustainable architecture firms, the kind of images that come up. In many examples of green design, green in quotes maybe, we can sense the utopian impulse to put nature back together again, undergirded by the belief, perhaps also utopian, that design would hold the power to do so in the first place. There's much talk of making buildings more energy efficient and otherwise environmentally responsible, as well as the occasional critique of the outsized role that the architecture or building industry at large plays in global carbon emissions. While certainly valuable in some respects, these kinds of responses may remain largely locked within the hermetic feedback loop of the hopeful techno-fix, or the idea that we can design our way out of any current eco-troubles. The architectural historian Daniel Barber rightly warns, however, that, quote, technological innovation, especially around sustainability, is too often framed as triumphant and unequivocal, rather than conditioned, complex, and often fraught with unanticipated consequences, unquote. Take, for instance, a banner project like Stefano Boeri's Bosco Vertical, Vertical Forest, completed in 2014 in Milan, with numerous spin-offs now in the works, particularly in China, which we heard about during his ONA talk last spring. Even while Boeri's photogenic green towers reflect a level of earnest engagement with botany on the part of the architect, many questions remain. Who can afford to rent one of Bosco Vertical's luxury apartments, and in so doing, to lift themselves out of the far less affluent and lush surroundings below? And I want to give photo credits here to Daniel Schwartz for this photograph. How much labor, capital, and resources are required to maintain the building's verdant facades? What are the ecological benefits and limits, or even pitfalls of such a work? Should its rapid celebration and adoption be taken less as a marker of the project's success and more as a reason for concern? We might likewise probe the sheen of green rhetoric, which at times represents nothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing. The architecture studio Adjustments Agency, which is run by Joanna, or made up of Joanna Kloppenberg and Nicholas Karodi, I hope I'm saying their names correctly, under the auspices of a project entitled Complicity, for instance, recently called the Chicago Architecture Biennial to task for its corporate sponsorship by British Petroleum. More broadly, their critical practice demands much heightened accountability and self-scrutiny within the field, as captured in a searing text from last fall 2018, in Harvard Design magazine. Quote, "What if we acknowledged that we had fallen out of love with architecture and couldn't remember why we loved it in the first place? That we had given up on building long ago because we had no interest in collaborating with developers, in designing money laundering schemes or parking garages for foreign capital? That we had seen the logos for the oil companies emblazoned on the bottom of the biennial posters and couldn't look away," unquote. And incidentally, BP, despite protests from Complicity and others, is still, for the 2019 biennial, a primary sponsor of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. At the very least, we should take pause at the fact that neither slick sustainable design projects nor the slick marketing that accompanies them typically gives any hint at all that something is seriously amiss. What kinds of design practices, by contrast, aim to serve as sensors of the present in its difficult complexity? Perhaps the act of puncturing a hole in a surface to elicit the whoosh of air that comes with its release, and the differential between inside and outside that is thereby made apparent, is one place to start. To unbreak by breaking. To foreground leakage as opposed to cohesion, so as to call various status quos, the anthropocentrism that characterizes virtually all design, the capitalist frameworks which rule the day, the fallacy that environmental issues are separable from social, political, and ideological ones, into question. Among elsewhere, we might look to disobedient objects that operate in parallel spirit to adjustment agencies' confrontational tactics. I think first of a project that I know only anecdotally. I don't know much about this project, and there's almost nothing that's published about this project, but it's mentioned in a really interesting text. It's a piece by the California-based artist C. Ree, who is also part of the queer indigenous feminist group, the Super Futures Haunt Collective. It's a series of installations called Dark Water from 2009 to 2010, inspired by the 2002 Japanese horror film of the same name, in which the artist staged water to seep slowly through the ceiling into carefully placed buckets below. In one iteration, after 2 weeks of percolation, the stained and waterlogged ceiling slumped to the gallery floor in a ruinous heap. Ree writes, quote, "The leak expresses the horror of walls transgressed, physical structures made permeable and violated of their visual promise of protective boundaries. The roof over our heads suddenly becomes the very source of a profound anxiety," unquote. I jump to a piece made by the Danish artist Tue Greenfort, Exceeding 2 Degrees, from 2007, made on the occasion of the 8th Sharjah Biennial, itself devoted to the theme Still Life, Art, Ecology, and the Politics of Change. For the duration of the exhibition's run, Greenfort raised the temperature inside the Sharjah Art Museum by 2 degrees Celsius by turning down the facility's air conditioning system. The 2 degrees in Greenfort's work, it might be obvious, or is worth mentioning, references the upper limit of the warning for global temperature increase identified by the IPCC, past which the risk of climate change, the changes are predicted to become potentially catastrophic. So it's a threshold that's been identified by the IPCC that he's referencing with the 2 degrees. So as part of this project, an amount of money roughly equivalent to that saved on the electricity by turning down the air conditioning was then used to purchase a small parcel of rainforest in Ecuador in collaboration with an environmental nonprofit organization. This gesture, at once highly site-specific and cosmopolitan, underscores globe-spanning interrelations between the art world, atmosphere, and economy, many of them uncomfortable, reminding us that we're far beyond the point of return to reductive notions of either nature or art's autonomy. The Iraqi-American artist Michael Rakowitz, from 1998 through to today, has fashioned a series of portable homeless shelters under a project titled Parasite. Made out of cheap, lightweight, and readily available materials such as plastic bags and duct tape, these structures are made to be affixed to existing buildings, taking advantage of their waste heat to keep inhabitants warm during dangerously cold winters. The homeless, of course, represent perhaps the most extreme example of societal exclusion and vulnerability, a population that is literally without shelter, without home, left outside, and perpetually exposed to the elements. In a radical reversal, with Parasite, Rakowitz collaborates closely with homeless individuals to create customized designs to their requested specifications. In effect, the artist takes them on as clients, flipping the typical class structure. Equally significant, in producing objects that enter into and visibly occupy urban space, maybe even forcing pedestrians, daily commuters, to step over or walk around them, this project forces us to confront homelessness for the profound social problem that it is, certainly more in the United States than in Switzerland, but in many places in the world. In a different final example, one closer to architecture, the architect Aaron Moore of Float Architectural Research and Design and the head of the School of Architecture and Environment at the University of Oregon, where I'm now working, builds architecture that serves as an interface between the human and non-human, attuning the former to the latter. She moreover designs toward greater ecological robustness or even ecological reparations, the inclusion of non-human species into a world that increasingly excludes them, often impeding their very survival. Of her 2008 work, Watershed, a writer's studio on a 40-acre piece of land in the Marys River watershed of Western Oregon, she describes the aim of moving beyond, quote, the usual dichotomy of inside and outside. The exoskeleton defines a multi-species inhabitable zone that is both inside and outside. The structure is designed to make space around it as much as within it, unquote. In this project, features such as a roof scupper feed into a water pool at the step of the cabin, sort of at the base when you walk up to it, creating habitat and attracting a host of different species, larvae, insects, birds, even bobcat, wild turkeys. A double roof accommodates, rather than ignoring or repelling, nesting birds and insects. There's a snake breeding den built underneath. While one might rightly note this idyllic solo studio on a large parcel of private green land is itself only accessible to a privileged few, the context here is not one of purely bucolic or wilderness qualities. In fact, the project is part of a wider ecological restoration effort in the Marys River watershed to actively combat accelerated species extinction and climate change in that region. Indeed, it is design that gives shape not to the new, but to encounters with existing realities that I'm trying to get at in this talk. The aim is no longer to fix with novel solutions or by proposing catchy new forms of second nature, as marketable as they might be, but rather to direct attention to points of instability, including various thresholds between the inside and the outside. Architecture and design are reimagined as the arts of amplification, and the projective mode that drives so much of architecture and design's identity is suspended in order to focus unflinchingly on the present. Furthermore, here architecture and design operate not under the model of a protective barrier that limits exposure, but to the contrary, in order to reveal varying levels of exposure. And I think it might be worth bringing the air conditioner back for a moment here to just think about this issue of what happens to all of these air conditioners in their sort of material afterlives and their dislocated afterlives. Many air conditioners, once they're broken down, in fact end up being exported to the global south, to places like India, and sold as scrap. These are often highly toxic, obsolete objects, which themselves leak, break down, and leach, inevitably making their way into land, air, and water, or becoming, we could even say, becoming new environmental agents in their imported contexts, in the process mutating these places in ways that are undoubtedly underconsidered. So coming back to Jason Moore, who of course is one of the key figures who writes about the Capitalocene and also has written about the theory of kind of cheap nature. I imagine he spoke to you about cheap nature. So the flip side of the kind of new, the gleaming kind of tower might be these kind of discarded or obsolescent objects, which are the waste or kind of byproduct of capital accumulation largely in the global north, which are then kind of relegated in their dirty leakiness, also out of sight to the global south. So let us end with another scene from real life. A group of exhausted yet determined migrants, some 7,000 strong, including many who have traveled upwards of 4,000 kilometers, much of it on foot, arrive in November 2018 to the US-Mexico border, which awaits them bolstered by additional troops, some wielding tear gas. These travelers have come from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, where generations-long agricultural lifeways have been disrupted, not least by a severe drought and resulting crop failures, along with the intensifying violence exacerbated by these same conditions of scarcity. The potential expansion of the physical wall designed to separate the US from the outside, of course, has been a central topic of political debate within the United States, one that has come to a head under the current Trump administration. It has likewise been taken up within architecture and design, most pointedly by those who have made calls for the profession to wholeheartedly and decisively denounce anything to do with such a project. In response to the government's invitation for border wall design prototypes, Architects, Designers, Planners for Social Responsibility, ADPSR, the nonprofit group, for instance, instigated a We Won't Build Your Wall campaign and submitted letters to the a letter to the Department of Homeland Security stating, quote, "Our message is simple. As architects, designers, and planners, we reject your border wall," unquote. Likewise, the group has called for a ban of prison design, seeing prisons as fundamentally corrupt institutions. Here, the withdrawal of design is a constitutive act, one that more generally refuses any disconnection between architecture and politics. And as a slightly long side note, I thought it would be important to also mention or locate a parallel kind of dissension that's going on in the art world right now, with very active protests around the Whitney Museum of American Art. I don't know if any of you have been following this controversy. The controversy is over the vice chairman of the museum board, Warren B. Kanders, who's the owner, chairman, and chief executive of the Safariland Group, which sells multiple lines of military and law enforcement equipment, including tear gas. It has been kind of confirmed by journalists, as well as people who were exposed to this tear gas, that it was tear gas from Safariland Group that was used against migrants at the Mexican border, illegally, by the way, in November of 2018. It is also a product that has been used against Palestinians at Standing Rock in North Dakota, also carried by the NYPD in New York City. So there's been a tremendous outcry about the problem, or what many see as a problem, of having this weapons producer be on the board of the Whitney Museum of American Art. We can link it also to a much kind of broader, like fossil fuel divestment and kind of museum activism, institutional activism that's happening now. Dozens of Whitney staff and artists connected to the museum, including more than half of those selected for the Whitney Biennial, which is opening later this week in New York, have called for Kanders to resign from the museum board. So it's been a very public kind of movement. In fact, the artist Michael Rakowitz, I mentioned earlier, is the one artist who officially withdrew participation in the biennial in relation to this issue. These protests are part of a growing movement in art as in architecture to hold cultural institutions accountable, and we could extend that also to educational institutions and all sorts of public and cultural institutions, to insist that they are not discrete or outside of politics, but are rather highly embedded, maybe even are a central locus of politics and of the polis, and thus a matter of artistic and architectural concern. Obviously, the US-Mexico border is today only one among numerous geopolitical boundaries that are under growing contention and lockdown at present in the face of unprecedented numbers of refugees and asylum seekers on the move and attempting entry. In many cases, the underlying reasons for migration are environmental, with that category understood expansively to involve a whole set of entwined factors, and in which case the stories of drought, tear gas, wall prototypes, and even air conditioning are part of the same story or seem to be related. As such, if we are looking for the story of broken nature, this scene is one where we might begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Great to have you. Very, very powerful, very clear. Let me introduce Christoph Kueffer. Welcome, Christoph. Christoph is Professor of Urban Ecology at the Landscape Architecture Department of the Hochschule für Technik, Rapperswil. He studied environmental science at ETH Zürich, where he received his doctorate in plant ecology and habilitated with a thesis on the ecology of global change. Christoph is a co-chair of Environmental Humanities Switzerland. His research focuses on urban ecology, nature conservation in anthropogenic landscapes, and the ecology of the Anthropocene. So since we have both of you here, and you started with the slide on your collaborative course, Concrete Jungles, could I ask you to tell us a little bit more on that before we go back to this topic? What was the experience of teaching this problematic at ETH Zurich for several years? How did the curriculum evolve? How would you carry it forward if you had stayed? So let's apply all of these issues to teaching and to our curricula. I think it's since you're the last speaker, I'm kind of really eager to look into the future, let's say, of our work with students.
Do you want to start first? I feel like I've been talking a lot. Maybe, should we talk about the Concrete Jungles class, you said, maybe first a little bit? Yeah.
Shall I start?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so the idea of the course for me was, on the one side, to find a forum to talk about the very basics of ecology in the context of architecture, and that's just because in my experience working with landscape architects, urban planners, and architects, I have this very basic reaction that here is this science and here is nature that has certain rules like physics, and these rules are so often forgotten. I often say in talks, you know, when you build a house, you accept that there's gravity, but then all the ecological laws that also exist, they are somehow forgotten, or they seem to be very flexible, adaptive, and nature can do everything, and we could do everything with nature, and I think we are at the point in cities and in our landscapes and on the planet when these laws become very important. That was one aspect. But then the other aspect, and that's what I experienced now in this talk again, was it's an interesting time, the Anthropocene, because some of our most fundamental questions in ecology and environmental sciences, and some of the most fundamental questions, I would say, in urban design, arts, and architecture, have parallels. And we approach them from different angles, more from maybe the social design side, on the side of architecture and arts, we more from the side of natural sciences, ecology, but sort of the kind of questions we have and how they align, suddenly you get these parallels, you get these crossings, and you get these inspirations in both sides. And for me, that was then really the inspiring thing about our seminar and about this talk here. During the whole talk, I realized that following your talk, I had sort of things I discussed and slides from other presentations that I maybe ordered in a different way, and they came in a new order, and I realized that there's many similarities. And for me, that was also at the seminar. And so I think beyond just ecology and ecological principles becoming really one of the fundamentals of designing a future, sustainable city, I think it's also that there's a lot of inspiration for both sides, and it's very inspiring to really get the ideas that work in the Anthropocene. And just before I give to you, I think it's really this intersection between art, critical social sciences, humanities, design, including architecture, and ecology that becomes so important, and that only works if you have a deep understanding of all the three legs, and then the openness to let them resonate. And that is what this seminar was about, and that is what I felt in your talk again now.
Yeah, I took, that one isn't so comfortable, so I join you all with the handheld mic. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say on just a kind of very simple, practical level. Christoph and I have known each other for several years now through this Environmental Humanities Switzerland group, which is a fairly small informal group. There are a couple of other people who participate in this group here at the lecture today. But it was a really great formation for me, and I've been drawn always for years and years to these interdisciplinary kind of study groups and art collectives, and I've been parts of lots of these kinds of formations because I find it always very exciting to work through ideas with people from different disciplines, or some are theorists, some are practitioners, etc. But there are scientists as well as humanists in that group, and I think we just had been to enough events where we were speaking both at the same on the same panels or at the same conferences, and we thought this would be an interesting experiment to have an ecologist and I'm sort of like I don't know what to call myself, somewhere between an environmental humanities scholar and a contemporary art historian, sort of confront this material together, like next to each other, and to sort of see what happens and to learn from each other. So I knew already from hearing Christoph speak for many years that I have a lot to learn from him. And so, it was on a simple level an opportunity to do that, but also coming out of the recognition that a lot of discourse around urbanism within architecture or urban studies or even geography, within sort of these discourses on the city or on rights to the city, kind of social justice, that often ecology kind of falls out of the picture, or the environment. And then at the same time, within the discipline of ecology or within the natural sciences, there's often a complete sort of refusal or a sense that the social or the political is outside of its purview. But I think we would both argue that, in fact, there are, my talk, I hope, also kind of demonstrated like that these need to be kind of examined, interrogated in relation, these kind of very, many fields, like there's many fields that come into play. It's even bigger than two fields. And I think that, one thing about the Anthropocene, even though I have ambivalence about this term, and I sort of hold it at arm's length, but I'm teaching this seminar, Sizing Up the Anthropocene, as I mentioned, where we're like reading tons of dense theory about the Anthropocene and trying to plot our way through it and find these different positions and that are taking shape relative to the term. You know, that one thing that is exciting about the Anthropocene that I think it's part of or indicates is, you know, these really fundamental kinds of breakdowns or questions, these collapses that are happening sort of with, you know, within humanism itself. So it's not even within art or a particular discipline. It's like humanism itself, kind of enlightenment paradigms, the age of reason. Like these things are really being very radically questioned by people coming from multiple angles, animal studies, multi-species studies, indigenous studies. And so, and you get, you know, someone like the post-colonial scholar Dipesh Chakrabarty already now 10 or 11 years ago in the Climate of History essay, this kind of, you know, very key essay in Anthropocene studies, if you will, says, you know, we need to really reimagine like writing human sort of cultural and natural history in entangled ways, like in relation to one another, and none of us know how to do this yet. It's very difficult to do it. So it's an exciting moment in that sense.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I greatly enjoyed it. I would like to try to connect your first image, the Singapore new airport with this unbelievable fountain in the center that I have not seen yet. Clearly, there you address, you know, one of the fundamental principles of architecture that, you know, even Semper addressed, the role of the enclosure. And then this last image at the very end of your presentation, talking about an entirely different kind of enclosure, the enclosure of a country vis-a-vis its neighboring state. And you know, the 30 minutes between the first image and the last image established clearly a connection between the two that probably Peter Sloterdijk addressed in his famous text on the interior of capitalism, okay, where he starts with the Paxson enclosure, okay, and he ends on the role of enclosures within capitalism in general, and of course architecture is complicit in the production of these enclosures. You know, you have Zaha Hadid doing a stadium, you have Moshe Safdie doing an airport, etc. So if you have those two images and you talk about breaking, okay, what do you mean by breaking? Okay, this is, architecture has been trying generally not to break. Okay? So exactly the opposite. And after, if you mean becoming political questioning, as these artists have done, then I'm definitely with you. But what happens after breaking? Okay? Just breaking is possibly not the end solution.
I mean, in a way, it's like a fairly sweeping argument I make in this talk. But I guess one point I'm trying to drive home is that from my perspective, it's like the sort of mode of operation which does typify like all sorts of things, like, as you say, sort of for the history of architecture, at least Western culture for, you know, hundreds of years. But that the result of that kind of enclosure-based thinking about kind of shelter or the separation between the human and the non-human, the environment, itself has broken many things. I mean, I don't want to head down the apocalyptic, pessimistic road, which I very quickly head down when I sort of am, you know, reading about mass species extinction and many other kind of predictions of the state that we're in right now. But it's back to the Toyo Ito quote, it's like this idea that like we are at the end of a paradigm that is a system that leads to a state of extreme enclosure and a polarization of the rich and the poor. And it's a system that is already at a point of collapse or has already been collapsing. So it's I think it's very difficult to then move to the next stage of what is after, but I do think that some of these practices that are already giving examples of sort of other, I mean, it's maybe less other forms of design. I think it's a hard question to translate it to these kinds of questions of form and shaping space. But I mean, even the development within architecture in the last 10 years of more and more people starting to work in terms of thinking like yourself, Milica, like doing work at the scale of territory and thinking about complex systems. And no longer can we think of architecture in terms of discrete buildings, but we think of, to borrow a term of, I don't know if it's your term, Barbara da Costa, of architecture as environmental objects. It's like really this moment of, you know, questioning how we think about architecture and space and land and environment and territory and all of it.
I mean, if I, shall I think for me, I talked about these parallels that are so exciting for me, and enclosure, that you focused on enclosure, really was very inspiring for me because I see both at the macro level of sort of the Anthropocene, sustainability, global environmental issues, enclosure at the center, and also at the microscene of cities and urban ecology, enclosure or breaking up enclosures has become, I think, one of the really central perspectives. And I can maybe say a few things about both. The Anthropocene, there's many stories you can tell about the Anthropocene, but the story I would tell as a sustainability scientist is that basically after World War II, there was an explosion of global extraction, exploitation of the planet, an exponential explosion that still goes on, and we have reached the planetary boundaries. We have to completely change that within 20, 30 years. For instance, CO2 emissions have to go to zero in 20, 30 years. And whatever you look at, soil, water, biodiversity is about to be completely depleted. And it's only 50, 70 years in which this happened. And if you now think about what this basically was, it's very closely linked, of course, to colonialism and colonial history, because it was basically Europe and parts of North America and a few other places that basically increased the land across the planet that served their machinery. And the Anthropocene debate, in one way, is the recognition of us that we reached the limits, and that it will talk back. The planet, or the limits of the planet, and the people that are affected talk back. So the story of the last 75 years of sort of this last phase of modernity was very much a story of us being in Europe in an enclosure, not feeling what was going on across the planet. And just what I thought now in the talk, just a random thought, but what I thought was interesting is, so first phase of colonialism, we conquered all these countries, and then in this phase of exploitation, where country after country, rainforest after rainforest were destructed, was the time when all these countries became independent. So, and it's sort of almost a way that the moment it became really bad at these places, they were not part of our country, of our nation anymore, and we didn't see it and feel it anymore. And I just want, so I think at the macro level, us being in a place where you don't feel what it means, all the exploitation of the environment is very central. And a few years ago, this is the last comment on this, there was a study being published that has become a central study in the last few years in sustainability research. They did a simulation model, like already the Club of Rome did, on whether we can still avoid global environmental collapse. And that's the Global Rome report. That's nothing new, these world models. But what they did in addition, they run these models in an equal society and in an unequal society. And in the unequal society, collapse becomes much more probable, because the elites that take the decisions, they can protect themselves for longer from all the negative impacts. And so enclosure might really become a very fundamental issue when we think about, can we still save ourselves or not. And I think it's very central to Switzerland, because if you have sort of one global gated community that is enclosure, it's Switzerland, where all the global decision makers are, all us having, and we sit here, and this has become the big question. Well, when will these guys in Switzerland realize that you have to do much more? But the problem is when you go out, it feels rather nice. So that's the macro level. Now, the micro level at the city scale, what is interesting is that even though in Switzerland we are in this enclosure, across Europe we are the country with the most destroyed landscapes and the highest biodiversity loss. Because we invest so much in agriculture, but agriculture is not productive. We destroy food with our agriculture. And I think that's also interesting because it's part of these control mechanisms. We destroy our landscape even though there's really no reason, because we are in the enclosure to keep things stable and social stability. We want to keep farmers happy, we want to have this same kind of residential housing that destroy the land, and to keep that stable, we invest more and more in something that is completely detached from environment and from the land. And with this, I come to the last part, and I think urban ecology and ecology in general, it's very much about how can we reconnect people, and that relates to your climate intelligence and so on. And there's a lot of debates now, going back to even the scale of a building, that with optimization of energy efficiency, which you have shown, we have basically made buildings more and more enclosures that become bad for health. You don't have air exchange anymore. You don't have enough daylight indoors more. People don't go out anymore. And we realize that this is bad for our health. And of course, it's even badder for our relationship with nature. And we realize that people don't understand nature anymore. They don't have any nature experience anymore. They don't know any species anymore. And we have even a term for that in environment science. We call it cognitive baseline, shifting baseline syndrome. You realize that whenever you ask people, are you happy with your nature? They are happy with your nature because they forgot how nature was just 10, 20 years ago, where there's so much detached from it. So this breaking up these enclosures of the building, more outdoors than indoors culture for health and ecological reasons, and then break up the boundary between the city and the surrounding landscape, this idea that you have sort of the city, which is all culture and buildings, and then you have the wilderness around it, and then the enclosure of the decision centers of the global elites and the destroyed planet. I think these have become the central questions of environmentalism, I think.
It's fantastic. I'm really loving this conversation. A couple of things. So Singapore airport, right? So when I saw this dome, I had immediately two films in my mind. One is called Logan's Run, a very kind of camp film from the 70s, you know, about the kind of a power dome as an instrument of control of a certain society. And the other one is, of course, Truman Show, so another kind of dome. So of course the enclosure is, I mean, you described it as a kind of a climate, of course in terms of a kind of climate apartheid, climate, you know, the dome is the object, the enclosure is what controls the, let's say, elite has excluded itself, right, and created an ideal paradise garden in a dome and so on. But on the other hand, it's also, it's another way of controlling that, you know, environment which is created inside the dome, right? So I think it's interesting, of course, to discuss climate change in terms of power inequalities and so on. And you know, I fully agree, and this is something we should discuss and teach and so on. And of course, what we want to go back to is a kind of a more benevolent type of enclosure, right? Enclosure is something which supports life but does not reinforce power inequalities, etc., right? So this is this is, Sasha Rossler also, who speaks about the climate and energy issues, has a very, very sophisticated argument. I mean, he spoke in this same lecture series about 2 months ago. But now, let me ask you this, right? So there is, imagine now we are here in this audience. What if we are already preaching to the converted, So let's say everybody knows, everybody understands, right? We are on the same page. So what shall we do, right? What shall we do? And I think as for people who teach, I think this is a rather interesting question, right? We can do it in many different ways, and how to unpack a plausible, intelligent project, in what kind of constellations of intelligence, of collaboration, do we need a chair of urban ecology at the Department of Architecture, how should we do this, no?
And then we open to the audience.
Sure. I mean, my first response would be that I don't think we're preaching to the converted, because I actually think maybe none of us in this room are converted in many ways. And I mean that partly because I think, along with these questions of design or architecture, I mean, there's a parallel to all of this, which is even like the discourse of climate science or climate change, right, is basically that discourse has been largely kind of controlled or enclosed, if you will, by economic, kind of Western capitalist economic and scientific framings. So many other people, of course, are articulating climate change from many other perspectives, but there's been a real predominance of certain perspectives and discourses that sort of have taken over. And so I think, to come back to your question about what's next, I mean, a lot of the work that I am finding myself most excited about, frankly, is work being done by climate justice activists. We hosted, as part of this lecture series, the Environmental Humanities Switzerland group, this amazing scholar who works on development studies from Delhi, India, Amita Bhaviskar, and she gave a talk about the Anthropocene seen from the Global South. And first of all, she says this term is not useful in the Global South. We don't use it in the Global South, which is probably a generalization. There are some people in the Global South who use this term, but she said it's like this is already an imperial Western Northern term. But she said if we want to deal with the Anthropocene, number one, we need to recognize that there's nothing new. It's embedded within kind of ongoing historical historical trajectories of colonialism and dispossession, and that in fact the place to look for how to move forward is in fact to go look at farmers in the fields in India who are in the middle of land use conflicts, like fighting for survival. Like, these are people to look to for how to move forward. It's not theorists of the Anthropocene or art history or architecture or ecology professors, perhaps, So I also think, there's this great text by Ana Maria León I just read in the book on dimensions of citizenship from the Architecture Biennale last year. And, she really makes a case for looking at kind of Black studies and Black theory. There are many others I think there are many places to look for kind of expanding perspectives and thinking in much more kind of nuanced and relational ways that are much less hubristic. And again, many things come into question, including the idea of expert knowledge, all of ours as well.
Just a quick, the first answer is very short and quick. Yes, I think you can't teach nowadays architecture without teaching ecology. If you teach material sciences or physics, you have to teach ecology. That's a simple answer. But I think there's and that's an important answer. Yes. But beyond that, it's really beyond that, I think if you started with the challenge to think beyond modernity, I think understanding ecology and ongoing debates in ecology can really help. Many of the key questions, dichotomy in nature and culture, multi-species relationships, going beyond thinking of control, standardization, and so on forth, that's all aspects where ecology can enrich thinking. For instance, there's this idea that evolution is about progress and novelty, but someone who understands evolution knows that it's much more about bricolage and muddling through, which is a different kind of concept. And I think in the end, when you come to teaching it concretely, it can be something very concrete where you then end up with big questions. For instance, one of the most common birds in Switzerland and worldwide, the house sparrow, has become rare in cities, and it can eat whatever we leave on the ground after lunch, but it has become rare because it doesn't find nesting sites anymore. With our new buildings, we just don't allow the little place where even the most adaptable bird can nest. And so this is a very concrete thing, but it's the big question. Do we want to share our houses with other species, and what does that mean? What do we accept? What don't we accept? Do we accept the sparrow under the roof, the tick, the wasp, and so on and so forth? So these are the kind of questions we have to ask, I think.
Great. Maybe before we answer, we open the floor for questions. We had placed you at the end of the series, and Jason Moore at the very beginning, and interesting enough, he talked about an ecology of hope. Okay? So he was extremely optimistic, and you sound now extremely pessimistic. So just, well, no. If you listen to what you just said, and we have the tape, no. What is interesting is he also spoke about breaking. Okay. He talked about certain crises that need to be introduced. He talked about geohistorical crisis, and he says we are at that moment, and it is this breakage, okay, this collapse that will probably activate something else, and this is where he saw hope, or what he called the ecology of hope. So I think it's very nice to have you at the beginning. We should invite you again at the beginning of the next one, and him at the end. Yeah. All right, let's open the floor for questions. We have only one mic.
Hi, thank you for this great lecture and conversation. I was in the class Concrete Jungles last year, and I've really missed being able to ask you questions, so I'm gonna steal the first chance that I got. So one thing that I've been thinking about, and I would like to hear your opinion on, is that coming from a history of landscape architecture, every time I hear the word enclosure, I can't help but think about Marx and the enclosures in England, and how that, his history of primitive accumulation, where enclosure was explained as the privatization of land. So the kind of seizing of the commons for private profit. And then, of course, he makes that link with imperialism and with colonialism, which is the whole story of Jason W. Moore. So having that in mind, when I look at this image, I can't help but remember that there is this frontier here, this very one, which is meant to keep migrants out, but there's another one which mirrors it, which is this kind of resource frontier, which is where these migrants are coming from, which is the places where the US and the global north is extracting and privatizing and expropriating the resources of the global south. So within this logic of enclosure as privatization, and this whole dynamic being the source of the Capitalocene, isn't the simplest explanation of what to do to decommodify land, to deprivatize land, and to rethink a certain kind of communism, to bring back some ideas of the commons, and also touching back on this idea of pessimism and optimism. In his latest book, Mike Davis, the book is called Old Gods, New Enigmas, and he ends with this beautiful kind of conversation with himself, where he opposes a sort of optimism of the will with a pessimism of the intellect. So a sort of hopeful, ethically hopeful, because you ethically obliged to be hopeful, but at the same time rationally pessimistic output, where he urges for us to go back to these utopian socialist, anarchist city plans, where I think architecture can actually give a kind of cue of how to live communally and how to share things. So housing, I think, that's my point, is the place where architecture might be able to help.
Here's the microphone. Christoph.
Oh, okay.
I have to turn it on. I think it's on.
Okay. Yeah, that works. I mean, the question of the commons is obviously a very big one, as you say. But a few quick things. The first one, there's a debate about the commons in sustainability science, and there's the two extreme. One is Hardin, the tragedy of the commons, who basically says commons don't work, and there's, I think, still the only economics Nobel Prize winner who is a woman, Elinor Ostrom, who showed that it can work very well, that you can have a sustainable management through commons. And I think the key message for me is that sustainable management of the commons work when you have a social order that grew over a reasonably long time. It's not something that you can just implement. And that's then as one of the challenges we have, that many things become possible once you have old-grown ecological systems that are enriched through history, and the same with the social cultural systems. And the other thing is these frontiers you mentioned. I was at the IP Best conference in Paris a week ago. That's the IPCC, the climate expert panel for biodiversity. And one of the big things that were discussed is really that around the world, indigenous people have exactly the same challenges, because the last indigenous people are rightly at the frontiers of the exploitation at the moment. That's reality.
I mean, I would just say, it's to change in such a short time the property relations. There would be a kind of a huge precarity in doing this, and the question is whether it would be a positive scenario or horribly negative scenario. Right? This is, if you look at Arab Spring, like look what happened in former Yugoslavia, for example. Not the kind of a crisis of changing the property relations and changing the power mode is always a risk of kind of ending up in a much more dire state, right? And this is, I think, essentially the is there a kind of a smooth and relatively painless transition towards sustainability that we could dream of, right? So I would say, nothing revolutionary, because that will probably end in a much harsher consequences. This would be my, maybe Emily will say no.
No, I mean, it is a great question, as your questions tend to be. And I don't have anything super articulate to say, except that, yes. I do think that the incredible and rapid and violent kind of dispossession of peoples and species and tied to the privatization of land, the corporatization of seed, the privatization of atmosphere, all of the above. I don't think it's enough on our radar as it should be. Like what's happening since Bolsonaro's election in Brazil, like this is not being covered adequately, at least in the US media. I know that, I don't know in Switzerland. But so part of it is just a kind of increasing attention to places that are kind of off of our radar by design, like intentionally made invisible, or things happening kind of without enough oversight. But then I also, to your point about optimism, you know, I do think one has to have models of sort of ways forward, or it becomes very paralyzing. And I've wanted to teach a class for a long time on the commons, so someday, this also links to your question about teaching, because right now I'm doing a lot of teaching, and I'll in the foreseeable future be doing a lot of teaching. So along with like a class on unnatural disasters, which will look at drought and sea level rise and all sorts of very like depressing things, and how they're also linked to kind of social justice issues. And I'd love to teach a class on the commons. And I mean, I think there's lots of fabulous, like sort of both activism and theory making and art practice out there that's very inspiring. I say that much. I mean, I know, Barbara, you and I like feminist, you know, speculative thinking. I mean, there are people who are offering exciting ways of sort of rethinking from many sectors. But I think you're right, these questions of like a fundamental reordering of society or economy are not, they should be on the table. Naomi Klein argues this in This Changes Everything. I mean, and she's shockingly optimistic and positive that this is totally possible to just redo the whole paradigm. Just undo capitalism and start over. So it's good to read these things too.
By the way, we have a class on the commons now.
Oh,
It's
really?
too bad you left the school. It's Tama Vermate is putting the emphasis of his curriculum on this subject matter. Okay, other questions?
Hi, I have done for another project, I've done some research on labels and like legislation, and especially insulation, and also on what political party says about that. And every time you read about that, it's mainly about you have to insulate more to have houses being more sustainable. And I mean, probably we all criticize that, but when I was reading that, I was wondering if it's not just to some extent wrong, but also when I was listening to your talk, like really fundamentally conceptual wrong, and if we have to change that like really fundamentally, because from what I understood now also in that talk is that it really starts from that small installation of houses, and it's extending to installation of countries and borders. And yeah, I was thinking about I'm wondering what you think about that, if there are not only some corrections needed, but if that really has to change like fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I mean, maybe you could use the word insulation along with the word enclosure as like a kind of paradigm. I think you're right that link is there. And I mean, of course, it's unrealistic to say we just get rid of all buildings and live outside and we're all exposed to the elements all of the time. This is not an option either. But yeah, you know, I like these sort of examples. The Aaron Moore example I gave of this building, of course, this is not a living structure. It's not even really an overnight structure. It's a writer's studio. So in that case, it's maybe simple to not have insulation and to have like the entire structure basically be kind of an aperture that you can open out kind of to the outdoors, and that it's like just this kind of, you know, this can work in a context that's much more difficult when you're in a sort of city and, you know, many people. And so, yeah, I think that thinking about the connection between something that seems technical, a material-based, like insulation and efficiency standards in relation to these kind of larger conceptual and ideological frameworks, I think that is really important.
Maybe a small anecdote along this trajectory is about 7 years ago, so we launched the Zero Emission Initiative at the Department of Architecture with colleagues from various disciplines, and all the professors at the Department of Architecture signed it, which was an unbelievable, rare event. And basically, we argued for using renewable energies and questioned the Minergie standard. Minergie standard requires more and more insulation, the philosophy being to save energy. And we had developed technical solutions that would allow renewable energies, store them in the ground, and therefore you could also waste some of the energy through the enclosure. Well, the consequence of this was that there were interpellations at our parliament against the Department of Architecture. They wanted to close the Department of Architecture because we dared to attack the Minagi society, okay, which was very interesting. And we got, interestingly, support from the ETH on our side. And we had, with a moderator, a series of discussions with Minagi. And we said, we will not teach Minagi at the Department of Architecture. So their standard that requires to have more and more. And we were able to find common ground to create a new standard that would not focus exclusively on thick enclosures. So at least that was a kind of a momentary success. But the enclosure, and this is what is interesting, was ultimately it was the enclosure in the head that didn't allow a certain industries that were behind it, selling triple and quadruple glass windows, to accept the fact that maybe we could do it just with singular glass. So it became very political, like this image as well.
Thank you for your lecture. We are students from the MIS in Urban Design, and we are focusing on the topic of cities and migration. So also thank you for using this image. We are working in Marseille right now, and we are confronting ourselves with a project site, Euromed 2 master plan, that relies a lot on labels of environmental sustainability and smart citiesness, but is actually very speculative and also kind of exclusive to our migrants that are living in the area. So we are really experiencing what's like to have environmental sustainability that is disconnected from social justice. So I was wondering, again, for this idea of hope, if you also encountered like positive experiences or practice that kind of matched urban ecology with inclusion for migrants?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to identify that often environmentalist kind of discourses and social justice discourses not only don't come together, but can even be in conflict with one another. But I do think that there are many interesting examples. Again, like I can think of examples from art or writers, activists that are sort of bridging them. Maybe a couple of examples that come to immediate mind, but these are more, well, like I think these kind of artists, I mean, this is a bit of a stretch, but I mean, I'm very excited about this decolonization movement in New York right now, and I helped organize a panel in New York in February where some of the key organizers who did this were speaking on our panel, and I also went to one of their workshops, and it's a really interesting group because it's mobilizing many people from many different sort of groups, and it's fairly young. It's not super intergenerational, but and that group, the collective is called MTL, but they actually have like 7 issues that they address in their practice. One is like Palestine, one is Black Lives Matter, one is like environment or climate justice, but it crosses. It's like kind of got this, maybe intersectional is the right word, I don't know, but it's like not drawing a line between those. It's like really, and they in fact, it was from them, in speaking in New York, that, well, they were just starting, it was not quite public yet, the Candors campaign. So I kind of knew about it before it went public, but they were the ones who made the link in their talk between the tear gas at the border and Candors being, you know, like this connection between the border and, you know, this kind of, you know, use of environmental chemical weapons, essentially, and then this kind of connection to the culture and art sector, and the problem with that. But, you know, Ashley Dawson is a scholar at CUNY Grad Center who's recently written on a book called Extreme Cities on Climate Change and Urbanism. And in that book, he's really, you know, it's a kind of a climate justice book that's looking at the unevenness between various cities in the world's ability, both within kind of a city, the like asymmetry between neighborhoods to contend with climate change and rising sea levels, storm fronts, et cetera, but also globally, the unevenness between sort of New York and, you know, a city in Bangladesh, which is more on the front lines, not the ones who created the problem of climate change so much, but are bearing the brunt of it, and then also have less resources to combat or respond to climate change. So dealing very much with kind of environmental conditions and social justice at the same time. But I think there are actually a lot of examples of people who are attempting to rectify this very problem of the separation of two trajectories of a kind of social justice, you know, post-colonial thread that's very human-oriented and urban in its orientation, and then more environmentalist discourse, which has traditionally been, you know, very weak in dealing with justice-related questions or race, gender, all of the above. But the environmental justice movement, you know, which really gained a lot of steam in the 80s, you know, this is kind of the place to look in general, I think, of bridging those. And yeah.
Thanks, Emily, for the talk. I really liked your example from Amitabh Bhaviskar about the farmer. I've been really attracted to this project by Agnes Dennis. I don't know if you know her, from the late 70s. Mm-hmm. And she's sort of like the pioneer of land art and also sort of this planetary movement of, like two-way movement of space. And I was wondering, what do you think of the wheat field project, which is sort of like in the late...
Wheat field, a confrontation?
Yeah.
Yeah,
like
it's a great project.
Sort of putting a wheat field next to the Wall Street, and sort of like, and what do you think of wheat field, and what do you think of the contemporary urban farming projects? Like, you know, do you think those are kind of confrontations as well, or they're sort of like just masquerading as a problem to the problem?
So that project is really interesting, and I might not get all the details right, but I think early 80s, Agnes Dennis, a wheat field where she planted certain amount of, like a fairly large wheat field on the southern tip of Manhattan near Battery City Park, and really Wall Street and then still the World Trade Centers were standing, of course, is like really in the immediate background. So this is the scene. And then she harvests the wheat and sells it, maybe even on the stock exchange. So it's really like kind of drawing our attention to this kind of differential in value of kind of the land as real estate, the land as sort of agricultural, kind of a space for agricultural production through a kind of public participatory art project. So yeah, I think it's a great project. And in terms of urban gardening projects now, I think that's a complicated question because I think they come in many shapes and forms. And there are definitely examples of urban gardening which become sort of like also part of, you know, sort of highly gentrified neighborhoods that have sort of the good life within the city. There's been lots of critical writing about the kind of urban green, artisanal kind of gardening movements in like places with astronomical rents where sort of a handful of people get to live and have a nice roof garden. But, you know, already the people who live there for generations are kicked out to some much less nice place to live. But then they're also, as a hopeful example, in Detroit, there's like an incredibly thriving, it's a terrible circumstance of like being food desert and like not enough grocery stores and obviously terrible water crisis in Michigan with contamination, in Detroit as well as Flint. I heard a great social practice artist, Pope L, African-American social practice artist, just spoke at Oregon about a week or two ago. He's done work on Flint water crisis and also in Detroit. But there's a very thriving African-American urban gardening scene in Detroit where people are literally like forming incredibly productive community gardens. Again, we can read that in many ways. The fact that they have to grow their food because they can't afford to buy food is terribly depressing, but it's also an example of like kind of community-based, like actual community-based urban gardening. And there was like a fantastic urban garden in LA when I still lived there for graduate school. South Central Farms, which tragically was the land, the developer who owned it, like sold it and became some god-awful, you know, like condo complex or something. But it was like a very long-standing community garden that like 50 or 70 or 100 Latino families like grew tons of their own food there. It was like a centerpiece of downtown Los Angeles. It was really a terrible, terrible thing when this kind of got swept away off the face of the earth. But so I think there's very different types of urban gardening. But we read in our class an article by Terry Weissman about the Detroit gardens, but also the kind of then pressure already for developers who are like hovering in the wings to be like, ooh, these urban gardens, and now the land becomes more green. Maybe there's a way we can sort of purchase some of that and capitalize on it. So, you know, it's a good article because it's a counterpart to the more kind of like, whatever, gentrified urban gardening movement, which is, of course, big in Brooklyn and places like that.
So I would like to say that I'm really just, you know, listening to you and having a chance to kind of reflect on the whole lecture series. I think it's really terrific that we end on the notion of enclosure. I think that's probably where every architect starts in the very first day of their architectural education, no? And we're now speaking about, you know, confronting the challenges of sustainability, of moving beyond the Anthropocene, literally rewriting the fabric of society, etc., and we come back to the issue of enclosure, right? And I think this is just fantastic. So, architecture indeed can be part of tackling all those questions in the most fundamental and disciplinary way, if you wish. So it's probably a terrifying moment. It's also hugely inspiring. So you know, beside urgency, there is also hope. So I look forward to continue together with you, together with the students. Thank you for being part of the lecture series. Thank you, Christoph, for these tremendous inputs. It was super exciting and a great final session. So we've come to the end, and I wish you the good ending of the semester.
Can I just make one small remark? Because it's not only the final session of this semester, but also the final seminar session that we are involved in as a chair with Marc, Angélil, and the various people who carried on this seminar. I think it started over 10 years ago as Urban Mutations on the Edge. It was one of the first English-speaking seminars. And I think exactly these kind of conversations that we saw today wouldn't have been possible at the school at the time, and I think sometimes are even still not possible. So I think I just want, without being nostalgic, I want to thank Marc for being open to have this seminar and starting these conversations that we had over the years. So, and also because a little bit of this reason, we have an apro that is waiting for you over there.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Marc.